Today in the Law News Docket, we're going to talk about the recent demonstrations and riots in Ferguson, Missouri. Unfortunately, an unarmed suspect was killed, and more than 300 people have been arrested in the past month due to the riots that broke out during the protests.
For today's broadcast, we want to kind of shift the focus of this event to how these incidents affect our justice system, including the cost, the resources, and more importantly, trust in our system.
Our guest, Phil Heimlich, will join in our discussion as we explore what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, and also how it relates to what happened in Cincinnati back in 2001. Phil, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate having you here today. Can you please tell us a little bit, just summarize your background?
Well, I was a prosecutor for 9.5 years with the county prosecutor's office. I kind of specialized in white-collar crimes, but did a fair range of different crimes I prosecuted. Served on Cincinnati City Council for 8 years, and I was a county commissioner for 4 years.
And when you were with City Council, that was right during the time of the riots, and right after that, I think you went right to the Hamilton County Commissioner's office.
Yeah, I was there during the riots of 2001, and I'd say that there's a lot of similarities between what happened here and what happened in Ferguson. You got a white cop, you got an African-American teenager, you have circumstances that look like it was unjustified, but you also have similar reactions. You got a lot of politicians jumping in, frankly, trying to take advantage of the situation. I think there's a lot of prejudging going on. I kind of feel a little bit for the cops in these situations because they tend to be tried and convicted before the facts really become known. And you also see a lot of law breaking that occurs that is disguised as protesting. I mean, my position back when it happened in Cincinnati, and I'd say the same thing about Ferguson, is I don't care what happened. That's no excuse to break into stores. That's no excuse to pull people out of their cars and beat them up. It's no excuse to throw a Molotov cocktail at a cop or destroy a small business. Cincinnati had $3 to $4 million of damage because of those riots, and Ferguson's had the same thing. I don't think any crime, even if it was a crime, and we're not sure about that, I don't think it justifies that kind of violence.
Do you think a lot of that violence, or a lot of the people that come in and riot and I guess you would call it protesting, they've lost, you know, kind of trust in our judicial system, that they don't trust the prosecutor's office, they don't trust the police department, they don't trust the judges, they don't trust the sheriff's department. Do you think a lot of that is frustration due to the fact that they don't trust the system?
Well, you hear that, but what troubles me is a lot of those guys came in from out of town. A lot of them were from other states. A lot of them had criminal records, and it kind of gives me the sense that not everybody, but a lot of the folks that come in look at it as a place to cause some mayhem, cause some trouble, break into stores, that kind of thing. I'm not minimizing the legitimate grievances and the protesters that were there legitimately, but when I see violence breaking out, I don't think that's any excuse to say, oh, we're committing acts of violence because we don't trust the cops or we don't trust the system. I'll tell you something else kind of interesting that I think is the kind of thing that Walter Williams, who's one of my favorite columnists, tends to focus on. Why is it when thousands of inner city residents, mostly African American, are murdered, raped, robbed on almost a daily basis, nobody cares? NAACP doesn't care. Al Sharpton doesn't care. The politicians don't care. In that situation, aren't their lives just as valuable? They're victims of street crime. Yet whenever you have this situation, white cop, black teenager, that person's life is considered more valuable than the lives of all those people that are victims of street crime, which none of those protesters seem to care about.
So you think it's an excuse, it's kind of a means to an end for them to come in and do the looting and just to cause mayhem?
Well, I think for some that's definitely the case, but even those that are legitimately protesting, I think there's a double standard. Why is it that none of these folks, particularly the folks on the left of the spectrum, why don't they care about all those mothers that are robbed on the streets of our inner cities? Why don't they care about the brutality that occurs every day on inner city streets? They don't seem to care about that. Certainly the NAACP and the civil rights organizations don't, but whenever you have this scenario, it becomes a national issue. We saw it in the Trayvon Martin case as well. And you know what's interesting is the fact is many times the cop When the cop is ultimately charged with a crime, was found not guilty, as was the case with Trayvon Martin. That wasn't a cop, but it was a neighborhood patrol guy. And we saw that with Roach, who was the cop here who shot Timothy Thomas. He was found not guilty as well. So there's an aspect of prejudging these things before the real facts come out.
What kind of, you were with City Council at the time, and then you went to the Hamilton County Commissioner's Office. From an economic standpoint for the city and the county, I would assume it had just a horrible, dramatic effect on the economy and the costs and the expenses that the city and the county incurred?
No question. I mentioned, I think it was $3.6 million of damage, property damage alone, then another $1 million or $2 million in paying cops for overtime and stuff like that. This was in Cincinnati. But here's where the real harm comes. It's the long-term economic damage, because when you have small businesses that are bombed out and destroyed, and when the public's sympathy isn't with them, the public sympathy is with the rioters. When that happens, all those small business people, they give up. They move out. It's that loss of business that really kills these cities when this happens. And nobody seems to care about that.
You know, I remember back before 2001 the riots occurred, and when I believe it was Bainey was the musician who was killed up and over the Rhine on Main Street.
Yeah.
Main Street was a very vibrant area.
Sure.
A lot of bars, you had the brewery up there, you had neons, rhinos, Japs. After the riots and after Bainey was killed, that place dried up.
No question.
What's the possibility of that occurring on the current Vine Street area, where you have all these beautiful bars and restaurants and businesses moving into? You know, my wife personally thinks that they're a murder or a shooting away from basically ending up like Main Street.
Well, let's face it. That story that occurred, unfortunately, our prosecutor's son got beaten up at Taste of Cincinnati.
Correct.
When those things happen, when those headlines happen, you can forget about it. People do not want to go down there. And fortunately, we've had a resurgence on Vine Street and over the Rhine since the riots, but it's taken like 10 years to build that up. So, you know, when these kind of things happen, the street crime, the rioting that's occurring in Ferguson occurred here, that is a death knell for business.
So what is the solution?
Well, I think the solution is to have tough policing. I think fair policing. You don't want to have discriminatory policing. But I also would say when these kind of unfortunate incidents happen, like the one that's occurring in Ferguson or what happened here, the police and the politicians have a tendency to just let these rioters kind of go free, like, oh, they got a vent or something. And there tends to be a hands-off approach. That's what happened in Cincinnati. No question about it. It was a hands-off approach. Look what happened in Cincinnati. They formed, after all the damage from the riots, they formed a Race Relations Commission. And who did they put as the co-chairman of that? The guy who started the riots, Reverend Lynch, Damon Lynch III. He was the guy who helped start those riots, and they make him the chairman of the commission. That is the kind of weak response from politicians, which causes businesses, and people might want to come down to say, hey, if they are supporting the rioters over the people who enforce the laws, I'm not coming down there.
What, at this particular juncture, you know, after the riots occurred with City Council, did the City Council develop any contingency plans or change, you know, things in anticipation of future riots?
Well, to tell you the truth, what they did was they, in effect, blamed the police. They blamed the police. They made it like the riots were caused by the police. And I was there. I was there when those riots started. I was in Cincinnati Council chambers. You remember that law and public safety meeting? Reverend Lynch marched hundreds of people in. And even in that meeting, there was no law and order. The people in charge were too intimidated politically to do anything. They just let them do whatever they want. Those folks marched out, and they started the riots, and that was the end of it. So, you know, the answer is, if you are not going to enforce the laws, you're sending a message out that people aren't safe in the city.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you very much, Phil. We're going to continue our discussion in the next part of the TV show here. And if you'd like to weigh in on today's news docket, go to our Facebook page, Cincinnati Law Works. Like us and follow us to get updates, and feel free to make comments. Thank you.